Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's webinar. The Bruges Group last met physically some 4 months ago, and since then the economic landscape has changed profoundly. Most Western central banks have eased monetary policy to an unprecedented extent. Here, the fiscal stance of the Conservative government has been relaxed in order to shield people from the economic consequences of lockdown. And there are indications that in the medium term and beyond, a bigger and more activist state is here to stay. However, one thing has not changed. We are still in the process of negotiating our future relationship with the European Union. Some might argue that the pandemic is fracturing globalization, and that trading within zones bound principally by geography will become a predominant trend. On the other hand, any disruption caused by leaving the European Union on WTO terms would seem minimal compared to the upheaval of recent months. The government has pledged initially, at least, not to impose tariffs on EU goods in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Could that become a more general policy? Today, ladies and gentlemen, we have a group of speakers that are uniquely qualified to address these issues. First, I'd like to begin by introducing Gerard Lyons, who acted as Boris Johnson's chief economic advisor when he was mayor of London. Gerard has had a distinguished career in the City of London, working as the chief economist at a number of major commercial banks, and has been awarded top forecaster accolade by the Sunday Times on a number of occasions. He also played a prominent part in the Brexit campaign, being co-founder of Economists for Brexit, and has authored with fellow Brexiteer Liam Halligan the publication Clean Brexit: How to Make a Success of Leaving the European Union. Over to you, Gerard.
Well, first and foremost, it's a great pleasure and great honour to be invited again to join the Bruges Group and to join such a great panel of three people who I greatly respect. Let me focus on three areas. One, where I think we are now in the macroeconomic picture. Second, about the crisis itself and what has changed and what has not changed. And third, the implications. And maybe let me start by just summarising the key message on the implications in terms of Brexit. Is that I do not think we should extend the transition period. Effectively, the message of no vote, no voice, no veto in the transition period still remains as strong as ever, and there is no reason in my mind to want to prolong that. Therefore, we should leave at the end of this year. But let me say where we are now. We clearly have had a health crisis and an economic crisis. We're emerging from the worst excesses, one hopes, of the health crisis, but we still have to overcome the economic crisis itself. In terms of the health crisis, in the unlocking phase, I work with Professor Paul Ormrod at University College London on this. Unlocking is clearly necessary to revitalise the economy, not just here, but in most other Western economies. Hence, as we unlock, the economy will recover. But in the unlocking phase, we have a vaccine gap. Therefore, we need to have testing, track and trace, and behaviours are key. Behaviours are key, as are those other two features. And it does unfortunately mean that we're likely to have localised outbreaks, but those localised outbreaks of the virus reappearing should not deter us from continuing to proceed with unlocking this economy, and that's true for other major economies. The vaccine gap phase, though, does mean that the business models of some sectors will not be able to return to normal very quickly. And I think this is important in an indirect way in the Brexit debate. the attraction of London as a global international city, the attraction of London as a regional headquarters, as a global headquarters, and a global financial sector owes itself to many different features. But undermining our creative sector by not coming to its help, I think, is a possible problem that we're overlooking at the moment. I think there should be further support given to some of those sectors most in trouble and whose business model will not return to normal quickly. And some of those sectors are important in terms of our global appeal, particularly for London as a financial centre. But the economic recovery, the key issue really is that as we unlock, we will start to see the economy start to pick up. There's been this whole debate as to whether it's the shape of a U, a V, an L, or a W. If you're an economist, you might well call it a V because the economy will pick up this year and next year. But speaking to non-economists, I think that conveys the wrong impression. It will not be until the end of next year, and maybe not until 2022, that we start to see the economy fully return to where it was before the crisis. The output level will not return until the end of next year, and we're going to see, unfortunately, a jobless hangover as we proceed into next year. So it's important to factor that in, and that justifies having an accommodative policy stance. But the key issue, and I'm sure Professor Congdon will touch on this, is what happens to inflation. In an environment of low inflation, low interest rates, and low yields, we have ample scope for both monetary and fiscal maneuver. However, if inflation starts to rear its ugly head, and it could for a number of reasons, those reasons are deglobalization takes hold in sectors such as manufacturing, leading to upward pressure on wages. It could be because there are supply side bottlenecks appearing, which means we start to hit those. It could be because of the monetization or growth in monetary policy and in monetary aggregates. I remember writing 2 or 3 years ago a couple of articles in the Telegraph about the fact that the Bank of England's then inflation reports, now it's monetary policy reports, never ever mentioned the word money. And I'll leave that for Tim to talk about, or indeed inflation expectations pick up. So that's the key risk area in terms of this global picture. But first, to conclude that first section, we are coming out of the health crisis. We are, however, still in the vaccine gap. Therefore, that will prevent economies from fully returning to normal. But unlocking of economies is justified and will allow those economies, including the UK, to start to pick up steam over the next 18 months. The second section, though, is the key one. It's really, what has this crisis shown us? There is a lot of talk about what has changed, but also I think we need to focus on what has not changed as a result of this crisis. But what has changed? I would call it the 3 Gs, grassroots, green, and geopolitical tensions, geopolitics. Grassroots is that more countries, including the UK, are focusing on what's happening at the local level, on national factors, on who's gaining at home. It's more a grassroots focus. The green agenda, I think, has come more to the fore, and the factor that even though many countries have talked globally and acted nationally, in some areas, such as the green or the health issue, there may be a need to coordinate policies globally in the future. But the geopolitical tensions are very important. There tends to be a focus largely on the US-China aspect, and that's very relevant. But also we should not forget or overlook the tensions evident within the Euro area in the early part of this crisis, and which have continued to prevail. And it really is a feature of talking regionally and acting nationally. There has been some coordination recently towards the last few weeks, but I think the underlying tensions reflected in the fact that the Euro system effectively has to become a political union to survive, an issue many people on this webinar have talked about themselves in the past. I think that has become evident as well. But what has not changed as well is important. Domestically, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, the Prime Minister and other members of the government have highlighted that the pre-crisis agenda remains very much to the fore. And I think that's right. Levelling up, we have an imbalanced economy. But when we talk about an imbalanced economy, let's not forget that some parts of the UK are world class, as well as the fact that other parts of the UK need to be helped and need to change and need to basically be incentivized to behave in a different way. The Brexit policy clearly is still unchanged. That's still there, as into is the move to net carbon zero. But also very importantly, and very important for the Brexit debate, is to not overlook, and we can easily do this, not to overlook the fact that two key global drivers that were very evident in the last few years, were very evident before the crisis, are likely to be very evident as we come out of this crisis. One is the whole fourth industrial revolution. That means the need to innovate, the need to change. It means that to compete globally, you have to be competitive, but you can't just compete on price, you need to compete on quality. And the UK needs to free itself, the precautionary principle we've talked about freeing ourselves from within the EU, but other aspects is about very much recognizing the need to move in a forward direction to reflect the technological change, the fourth industrial revolution. The other key global feature is the shift in the balance of power. And this is not just the emergence of China, this is the emergence of the whole Indo-Pacific region, as I would call it, from India in the west to the US in the east. It helps justify and explain why I think Liz Truss, the Secretary of State, has been focusing on networks. Naturally, we want to have a good future relationship with the EU outside the political constraints of the EU. But at the same time, this is an opportunity through our new trade policy to actually start to take advantage of those global networks, which were very evident before, and I think will become very evident after. So to conclude the second part, is not just about what has changed, it's also about recognizing some features that have not changed and which will become very important in the future. Third and finally, what does that mean for policy? Well, good economics is good politics. And the good economics, I would say, is that we have an opportunity to build a domestic macro financial and supply side policy that allows the UK to move into a higher growth trajectory in the future, but it does take time. I've called it the three arrows. And like with any arrow, the idea is that you hit a bullseye. I did used to call it three legs on the stool, but I realized that wasn't such a sexy description. But the idea is each leg carries its weight, but three arrows might be a sexier way of saying it. But on fiscal policy, it is a difficult one because most people are not used to the idea that it might be right to allow the fiscal room for maneuver that we're currently seeing. But as I explained earlier, it does depend a lot on the environment in which we're in. We have had historically times when debt to GDP has risen significantly, largely because of war. It's risen this time partly because even though we had incredible fiscal policy, you could argue over the last 10 years, we went into this crisis with debt to GDP still at maybe a higher level than some people would have been comfortable with. But what we found after the Second World War is that debt to GDP can be brought down steadily over time if you have basically a focus on growth and also in some respects financial repression as well with low rates. But fiscal policy, there is room for credible fiscal activism, but you do need to create that fiscal space to have credibility about being able to bring the debt picture back under control in the future. But I certainly just agree with the scope to which fiscal policy has been used. You can argue whether everything needed to be done, but there are still some gaps. A key group of workers have not been able to access the government schemes, but credible fiscal activism is one. Second is monetary and financial policy. Monetary policy needs to be consistent with fiscal policy. At the same time, we need to have financial stability. I would advocate moving to a money GDP target at the Bank of England, partly because I think it gives us more room for maneuver in the future, but not because I would be advocating accepting rampant inflation or anything like that. It's about ensuring monetary and fiscal policy and financial stability are consistent with one another. But the other arrow, in addition to fiscal policy, monetary and financial, is about the whole supply side agenda. And that's where we really do need to focus our attention. But this takes time. It's not just about infrastructure in the north of England, as everyone was talking about last few days. It's probably bringing all the eyes together. Infrastructure is one of them. Innovation is very important. Investment, we need to be incentivizing the private sector to invest. And it's about getting the incentives right. I would, for instance, be advocating the coronavirus fund to put equity, not debt, into some of the firms who need help as we come out of this crisis. But it's about getting all the incentives right, and the other eye is reducing inequality, which I think we have done, but probably need to do more of. So it's about getting that whole supply side agenda right. And as Barry touched on at the beginning, we have had an interventionist approach so far. The Prime Minister the other day said that was the foundation. He implied more in the Q&A the other day that was then about allowing the private sector to really gather momentum. And I think that's where the real test will be. On top of all of that, the Brexit agenda gives us another extra room for maneuver. The ability to leave the EU presents as much opportunities now post the coronavirus as it did before. At the same time, I think the tensions, as I touched on, that were evident early in this crisis in the EU are an indication of problems maybe to come in the future. Whether one has higher inflation, in which case they might come to the EU sooner, or even without high inflation, when the growth divergence within the EU and the euro area in particular will cause tensions. So I think we are better off out. This crisis, in my mind, reinforces that. But at the same time, it reinforces the need to use that common external tariff and that free trade agenda to position ourselves in those networks with other fast-growing regions across the world. So I would bring it all together and finish by reiterating the initial point, no extension, because no vote, no voice, no veto. And at the same time say that this crisis has highlighted that at a global level, things haven't really worked well. The G20, for instance, on the eve of this crisis, produced the communique with a one line at the end of the first paragraph mentioning coronavirus. I've been advocating a G20 secretariat, or a D10 secretariat, as the UK might want to call it, where we have a fixed regime place. Maybe that secretariat should be based in London. But in the absence of these global mechanisms working, it reinforces the need for us to act out ourselves at home through a credible macro, financial and supply side policy, and having a sensible future relationship with the EU by being outside the EU, and then allowing us to build those networks globally as well. Thank you for your time.
Gerard, thank you very much for that thoughtful and comprehensive analysis. It's most welcome. Our next panelist is Tim Condon, one of the world's leading monetary analysts. Tim has had a distinguished career as a journalist and in the City of London. He has published a number of significant works, including Keynes, the Keynesians and Monetarism, and Money in a Free Society. He has also acted as an advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Much of his energies are now devoted to the Institute of International Monetary Research, which he founded at Buckingham University. Ladies and gentlemen, over to Tim Condon.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Oh, very good. Okay, then. I have got a PowerPoint, and I hope that works as well. That's just anyway. First of all, can I just again thank Barry and Robert for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's an honor and a pleasure. Very nice just following up from Gerard Lyons. He reminded us that monetary union means political union. And this, of course, is one of the key lines that the Bruges Group put into British public debate, what is now, what, 30 years ago, I suppose, over 30 years ago. And it's being confirmed again as we speak by what's happening today in the Eurozone. And I'm going to talk about that. My three main areas of discussion here are going to be, first of all, what's actually happened to public policy, not just, by the way, in Europe, but all around the world because of the coronavirus. Then I'll talk a bit more about what's going on in the Eurozone, and then I'll finish off with, perhaps as Gerard has anticipated, a warning about inflation. Now, the principal public policy responses to this pandemic have been the lockdown, the government attempts to mitigate the damage to incomes and potential living standards from the lack of output, and so been a big increase in budget deficits. These deficits have been financed to a significant extent from central banks, which have created new money. And central banks on top of that have carried out these QE exercises, quantitative easing exercises, been buying assets from the non-bank private sector, which again increases the quantity of money. So what's happened is that there's been a surge in money growth of a kind we haven't seen for a very long time. And in the Eurozone and the UK, this has been quite marked, but the place that's really gone way outside is the United States. I'm not talking about that today, but I think it's very important for the global prospect looking into 2021 and 22. Now, and then by implication, just say that I'm very clear that what then will follow will be a inflationary boom and inflation. I don't share some of these views about there being a slow world economy and a slow recovery. I don't agree with that. So we may have some crosswords, Gerard, about that, but we'll see how we go. Now, let's then look at the, I hope this, I'm told I'm just to press a button here and the PowerPoint presentation will come up. The main point about this is that the tensions inside the Eurozone have been much worsened by the coronavirus, and the problems of restoring sound and sustainable financial policies have again deteriorated. I'm not saying we haven't got our own problems, but and indeed as other countries, but let's just look at, I hope this all works. Now, in the Eurozone, we've got these tensions between the countries with high public debt, and the Italians have got a public debt that's about 140, 150% of GDP. It was coming under control. It's not coming under control. The EU as a whole, or rather the Eurozone as a whole, had a ratio of public debt that again was coming under control. They had a budget deficit last year of 0.5% of GDP. This year it's going to be almost 9% of GDP. GDP's gone down. So the ratio of public debt across the Eurozone has moved up about 17% because of this, from 83% to 100%. And the Italians and the Greeks and so on, it's all got very much worse after quite a long period of trying to make things better. And one should just say here that the Greeks, having had this debt moving up to twice GDP, defaulting on the debt in 2011, they then did pursue a long period of trying to achieve stability. They recovered confidence in financial markets. They brought the interest rate on their debt down to 3%. And even though the debt is still 1.5 times GDP, the interest payments are 5% of GDP, it's sort of sustainable. And all this kind of stuff has been put to one side by what's happened in the last 3 months. The tensions between the various members of the Eurozone are there and getting worse. And this is evidenced most clearly in this incredibly technical subject of how much the different central banks owe each other in the a target two settlement system. This essentially is the settlement system between the different banking systems of the Eurozone members, and is effectively part of the public debts of the nations involved. Now, I think some years ago, John Redwood and Norman Tevitt said this is a bit like sharing the same bank account, and in a way it's like sort of a rich businessman marrying a pretty actress and sharing the same bank account. Of course, I'm really thinking here of Germany and Italy. And what's happened is that the Italians have run up a very big debt, and it turns out that the rich businessman can't very well divorce the pretty actress. Now, I'm being a little bit, there are several countries involved, and it's not just Italy has a big debt, but what's happened is that the Italian and Spanish combined debt, the two biggest debtors, to the target two system, has increased very sharply in the last few months. And so there's this, and this is really why, you know, going back 30 years, many people, I think all of us on the panel, we all warned, Barry and others warned, that monetary union meant political union. I don't know what's going to happen here. All I would say is that, you know, the so-called frugal four, by the way, don't include Germany, are, in my view, quite likely to reject the proposals for a pan-European fiscal package, 750 billion euros, which is in fact that, if that goes through, that really is the thin end of the wedge of full fiscal centralization in the Eurozone. And then, of course, if you join the Eurozone, then you are all caught up in this. So it's meaning that, in fact, this becomes a fully fledged federal state. And that was indeed, if we got mixed up with the single currency and stayed in the EU, that was what was going to happen to us. Let me finish by saying that we have seen a staggering acceleration in money growth across the main countries, not so much, by the way, in China and India, but certainly in the main industrial countries in the last few months because of the coronavirus and the policy response. Gerard was relaxed about some of these. I'm not. I think that we're likely to see a sharp acceleration in inflation in Europe and the UK. I would quantify this as something like 5 to 10% in the next, so we'll see that kind of inflation in the next couple of years. And in America, where they've had a quite astonishing acceleration in money growth in the last few weeks and months, one can't avoid the fact that there's a presidential election going on and a lot of bribery of the electorate as well in happening, that I wouldn't be surprised if we see double-digit inflation. Can I just, before I finish on this front, and I don't want to, Gerard, I agree with so much of your presentation, but something I didn't agree with. Let's just be clear that in the last few months, there's been a lot of things postponed, not just my haircut, but also things like car maintenance and so on. Many of these things will then there'll be a catch-up process. And my guess is also that what's happened in this last 3 or 4 months is that inventories have been run down, stocks have been run down. My wife keeps on telling me that she wants to get something on the internet and she finds she can't. It's because they're not there. So life returns to normal, burst of orders. And the fact that there's been this rapid money growth fits in with this picture. So I think we're going to see, as life, I think you probably know more as than any of us, Gerard, being close to the government, but it seems to me there's going to be a vaccine available fairly widely early next year, so that in fact life will be returning to normal in the spring of next year. And I think we're going to see an inflationary boom. How does that affect Brexit? I can't see any obvious direct connection, except that we're going to see a lot of tensions between our neighbours, as well as the inevitable bargaining between ourselves and the EU, as we try and remain friends and establish as close an approximation to free trade as possible within Europe, including Britain. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. Bruges Group meetings are sometimes people are all saying the same things. But I'm glad we're actually having some difference of opinions here and airing them, because we are in a crucial position in this country as to in which direction we go forward. Now, our next panelist is the Right Honourable Sir John Redwood. There's no one in the House of Commons with a better grasp of economic and financial issues than John. He also has unique experience of policy formulation, having headed up the number 10 policy unit. Before entering Parliament, he worked for a major financial institution in the City of London and is now Chief Global Strategist at Charles Stanley, as well as writing a monthly column for the Financial Times. John has held many high offices of state, but first and foremost, he is one of our finest parliamentarians with a deep understanding relating to our relationship with the European Union. Over to you, John.
Well, Barry, thank you for those very kind words. May I begin by praising Tim's work and say how much I agree with him that in the case of the United States of America, where the response is off the charts and quite unprecedented, there must be inflationary consequences. If you create $3 trillion extra in the space of 2 months and stick it into the markets in any way you can, it would be very unlikely not to see an inflationary result. And we've seen much faster money growth in the United States of America than in Europe or the UK, although here too, as Tim rightly points out, there are similar directions of travel, but nothing like the scale which must have the inflationary consequences in the United States. And with Gerard, how much I agree with him about how the government must stand firm and conduct any remaining negotiations in the run-up to our full exit at the end of this year. I'm delighted the government has made clear to the European Union we are finally going to shake off the coil of their regulations and courts at the end of the year, with or without a free trade deal. I think the only way you're likely to get a free trade deal out of them is not to give any ground at all. As soon as you start giving ground, the EU will dig in, as they have done over the last 4 years, and just expect us to make more and more surrenders. So like Gerard, I think we don't surrender our money, we don't surrender our borders, we don't surrender control over our laws, we don't put ourselves back under the jurisdiction of their court after we've properly left, and we don't give away our fish. Our offer of a free trade deal is a generous and sensible one. It is in their interest to take it up, but if they are playing politics rather than thinking about the economics, they may choose not to immediately. We should make our own dispositions, and I think we can be better off, not worse off. I think the COVID-19 crisis and the severity of the impact on the economy of the measures that governments have thought necessary to take to pursue health policy puts the Brexit discussions and debates into context. As one of those, like many of the people on this meeting, no doubt, who fielded quite a lot of the economic business and city meetings in the run-up to the referendum, it was a very frustrating experience because our opponents on the Remain side wished to make out that our prosperity entirely rested upon our membership of the European Union for no obviously good reason, and wanted to make out that there would be huge economic damage if we just went ahead and left without effectively negotiating a new settlement with the EU that they wanted to look remarkably like the old settlement without the vote and voice that we had as full members. And I could remember with others wanting us to make moderate and very realistic claims. I think we made pretty understated claims. I used to say that if we had a government that took advantage of the freedoms and followed a sensible economic policy, our growth rate could be a little bit higher than it had been while we were members, but that would be a benefit after the decimal point, but there could be a positive. And if you had a foolish government, a government followed bad economic policies, then you wouldn't get those benefits. It would rest in our hands. And our opponents said that there could be a rather substantial reduction in output and incomes. But when you examined what they were saying, they had compounded up several years of slower growth. They weren't actually saying over the medium term that we would be worse off, although the headline said we would be worse off. They said we wouldn't be as much better off if we left the European Union because our growth rate would be impaired. But they were talking about an impairment of the growth rate, again, after the decimal point. They weren't talking about massive falls in output over that time period. What we've seen with COVID-19 is the likelihood of something like a 20% reduction in output in many countries around the world, because obviously if health necessities require you to instruct about a quarter of your economy not to undertake any business activity at all, and if it instructs most people to stay at home and not to go about spending on many of the things that they were spending on, if the idea is to kill most travel, entertainment, hospitality, leisure, and so forth, there will be a very big hole in the economy for the period of those closures. And if you take an industry like cars, which was often the center of the battleground, the big multinational-based industry, where one or two multinational companies were very wedded to the European Union or willing to offer quotes which helped the Remain campaign to allege that the car industry could be badly affected by our leaving without a deal. Again, they were talking about possible reductions in export sales for the UK industry if we ended up with a 10% tariff on cars into the European Union. They hardly ever put the positives on, that of course there would have been offsetting domestic sales because there would have been a 10% tariff on their cars into our country as well, and they sold us rather more than we sold them. But they, again, were arguing for relatively modest amounts of damage, although they tried to big it up. But what COVID-19 did was it closed all the car factories in Europe for more than a month. It led to a 99% fall in car sales in 1 month in the United Kingdom. And we're now looking at the prospect that when the industry recovers, as it will do gradually, it won't get back to the former levels of output and sales, primarily, I suspect, because the whole tenor of particularly Europe and UK policy is against petrol and diesel cars. And so you're going to see a very extensive transition, and it's taking a bit of time for enthusiasm to build up for the electric car product. And I just remind people of this because it puts into context those rather unimportant arguments we were having about what would happen if you had a modest increase in the price of a foreign car, or more particularly in a car we were trying to export to a foreign country, when you see that what is now going on is having a massive and possibly long-term damaging effect upon the car industry. Now, what we can also take from COVID-19, I think, is that contrary to the Remain view at the time of the referendum, we have some amazingly talented, primarily private sector companies and suppliers who are able to respond to far more dramatic changes than our leaving the European Union in a relatively short space of time with remarkable results. Let me give you one example. When the COVID-19 lockdown started, a large amount of food was sold in wholesale packs and formats under binding wholesale contracts to the catering industry, to all the canteens, cafeterias, restaurants, hotel groups, and so forth. And that food wasn't immediately available to put into retail packs for the retail customer, and all the people who had been having their lunch in the works canteen or their dinner in the local hotel were suddenly having those meals at home, and they were rushing out to the supermarket, expecting the supermarket to have all that food, which was still contracted to the catering industry that couldn't use it. And I think it was quite remarkable. We had 1 or 2 days when there were worrying signs of completely empty shelves in some supermarkets and when basic foods were suddenly under pressure. And yet the system adjusted incredibly quickly, and people found ways to cancel the wholesale contracts, develop the retail contracts, get the stuff repackaged. And within days, we had an amazing supply chain, delivering it all to the shops in retail format so that we could have our 2 or 3 meals a day at home with plenty of choice and supply. And that kind of shock was in a different league from the alleged shock that Remain put forward that there could be too many box tickers at Dover and there could be a lorry queue. And that was a particularly stupid scare because, as far as I know, we'll be running Dover. And so we had absolutely no reason to mess up our own port trying to import the food we needed. So I hope people will take away from the COVID-19 disaster and stresses that actually the economy is remarkably flexible and reactive, and that the changes we have in mind when we leave the EU are relatively minor. So in the brief time I have available, let me just make a few remarks about why I think the opportunities from Brexit are still there, how we can seize them, and why it means that with a properly managed Brexit, with or without a free trade deal kicking in on the 1st of January next year, we can have more economic activity rather than less from quite early stages. Some sectors have enormous opportunity. Just take food and farming. We've seen our market share in temperate produce, the kind of things we can grow and rear at home, plunge during our years in the EEC and EU. We were in the mid-90s from memory when we joined, and we're now down around 70. We can recapture quite a lot of that lost market share by making sure we have a domestic farming policy which makes sense for British food and British farmers. And I think there will be much more interest, as Gerard was implying, in more local resilience, national supply and so forth. Much of our import comes from the Netherlands. Their climate is no better than ours. Their ability to out-export us has quite a lot to do with the subsidy and gas price regime and so forth that applies. There's then our fishing industry, where we were a decent net exporter of fish with a large industry with many, many boats in the leading fishing ports going out day by day. We now have an opportunity both to catch less fish from our fishing ground by cancelling many of the licenses for the foreign vessels, but also to catch and land more for ourselves and add value here in the United Kingdom to the fish we bring in. We may want to export some of that fish. It makes sense to export it with value added where we are, but I think also supply more of our own fish, because the country with probably the best fishing grounds of the EU countries when we were still in it has managed to get itself into a position where it depends on quite a lot of imports for our own fishing need. We then have manufacturing, and I'm very pleased the government is developing the line that I was very keen on throughout the referendum campaign when dealing with the tariff arguments, saying, well, the right strategy for Britain is to have no tariffs whatsoever on components and raw materials needed for manufacturing in the United Kingdom. And that is the way they are going. They've been cancelling various tariffs for our new schedule when we are independent, and that could give us a boost. I hope also we will use intelligent government procurement, building on the theme of national resilience, not ducking competition, but encouraging domestic competition so the taxpayer gets a decent deal. But we've lost a lot of manufacturing capacity because we played by the rules and allowed free bidding from continental companies that managed to secure contracts, whereas it was very difficult for our manufacturers to get the same treatment going back, even though the rules were meant to be the same. I think we have plenty of opportunity for trade deals. I think it's wonderful how Australia and New Zealand, who we let down very badly when we entered the EC by severing their advantageous trade deal with us, are very willing to have a new one with us now. We are becoming a free country. It looks as if Japan and the wider Pacific area is very keen on us being part of the deal. And I think Mr. Trump would dearly love a deal with him before the presidential election. So it could well be we could get some good news on our trade policy. I think in the case of energy, we're leaving just in the nick of time because we are being dragged into the snare of a single energy market in a part of the world that is short of energy. And we are being dragged into a system cruelly dependent on Russian gas. And the more interconnectors we put in to buy power from the continent, the more we are likely to end up vulnerable to the Russian gas problem. People like to pretend on the other side of the argument that we're just going to be buying clean nuclear from France, but you can't guarantee that in an integrated system. And the Germans are quite insistent that the continent of Europe becomes more and more dependent on Russian gas, with the big increase in pipeline capacity going in at the moment against the wishes of our American allies. So I think we need to have a strong, independent, domestically competitive energy policy, which is also aware of the strategic realities in the modern world, because you cannot trust Russia. We've had our public disagreements with Russia and problems with Russia in recent years, and I can see no reason why we'd want to join the continent in increasing our dependence on all that. And as Tim was saying, how good we're not in the single currency, as it flounders as to whether it's going to be a proper transfer union or not. It is in practice a transfer union through the Target 2 balances, all done at zero interest, but they're not called grants, they're still called loans. But it would be quite difficult to see how that money could be reclaimed by the Germans and the other creditors in the system from the weakly financed deficit countries of the South. So in conclusion, I think we're leaving at a very good time. I think the lack of strategic vision and the rather strategic naivety of the continent in its relationships with Russia and to some extent in its relationships with China mean now is the time for us to strengthen our alliances with the Western democratic side of the world, our Five Eyes Alliance for intelligence. And I think we do need to work with America, Taiwan, Australia and New Zealand and so forth in the digital space, because I think we are seeing a splinter net or a cyber curtain coming down, and you'll either be with the Chinese model or you'll be with the American model. The continental Europeans are reluctant to understand the clarity of this divide, but that it is going to drive them. The UK has a better, more vibrant tech sector already, and if we welcome this and work with the right collaborators, we can be richer and stronger as a result. So there are my conclusions. COVID-19 shows that we were arguing about comparatively minor things. It shows that our private sector can be extraordinarily responsive and flexible. There are going to be massive changes on the back of COVID-19. I agree with Tim that we will recover, but I don't agree we will recover, not that he said it, we're not going to recover to the same economy as we have before. Some areas of the economy are going to be considerably bigger and strengthened, particularly the whole digital revolution section of the economy, whereas some of the travel, tourism, and hospitality is going to be scarred for a considerable period of time. But Brexit is full of opportunities. Please may the government make sure we get all our freedoms back, we get all the powers back, and we then have policies that power a proper economic revival.
Well, thank you, John, for that comprehensive and most thoughtful analysis. Can I also say to those that are listening in that we hope to have a short period for questions after our speakers have completed their statements, and if you could post your questions on the Bruges Group Facebook page, that would be most helpful. Now, our next contributor is Professor Patrick Minford of the Cardiff Business School. Patrick has been a staunch advocate of free market economics for over 40 years. He promoted Thatcherite economics before Thatcher. Most importantly, Patrick has consistently argued that Britain would be better off out of the European Union, and he has produced a number of editions of his book, Should Britain Leave the European Union? An Economic Analysis of a Troubled Relationship. Patrick is chairman of Economists for Free Trade. He supports the government's strategy of seeking a free trade agreement with the European Union, but in the absence of such an agreement, he maintains that the UK will achieve strong economic growth in the medium term, trading under WTO rules. Over to you, Patrick.
I hope you can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes,
oh,
fine.
Very good. Well, thanks very much. I'm going to show a few PowerPoint slides. So thank you very much, Barry, for your very kind opening remarks and of introduction. You're too kind. And I'd like to say I much appreciated the previous speakers' contributions, as always. And I'm really sort of like tail gunner, rapper here. I'm going to really not disagree with the previous speakers, but in a way just sort of go over the same ground and try to summarize it. I've got a PowerPoint presentation which I'll try and share with you. So I'll share my screen now with you all. If I can just find this presentation here. Here we are. So hopefully you can.
We can see it, Patrick.
Is that you can see it all?
Yeah, we can see the start of the presentation. Yes.
That's very good. So excellent. So I'm going to hang on a moment. Let's see. Yeah. Here we are. I rather sympathize with Tim about the technology being quite iffy, and but luckily we went through a few technical issues yesterday, and I think it should work. So I want to talk briefly about three things: the Brexit, what about the outlook with the coronavirus, and also what about the public finances and post-Brexit fiscal policy. So start with Brexit. As has been pointed out, that there are gains to us from Brexit through free trade, having our own regulation, and controlling our borders, getting the immigration that's more skill-based, that's more suitable for us, and gets rid of the subsidized, unskilled immigration that came in great profusion here. And also, of course, get control of our budget contributions so we don't keep on spending money to the EU. And as John Redwood said, it's 7% we calculate in the long run, but of course that's adding a percentage point basically to economic growth over a decade, because that comes in over time as a slightly higher growth rate. 7/10 of GDP percentage. So that's all worth having and really important, because it also allows us to do some other, gives us greater freedom in innovation and also in our fiscal policy, as has been pointed out. And the main argument that's been brought against these gains that come about mainly from getting rid of the barriers against trade with the rest of the world have come from the Remainers who have advanced the point that it's all about EU trade. But of course, that has been based on this much misused and abused gravity model, which actually doesn't fit the UK very well at all. The gravity model emphasizes that distance is the main thing that fuels trade. If you're close to markets, the growth in those markets sort of drive your trade, and then they drive your productivity as well. So what you've got then is, in this so-called gravity model, is a turning on its head of the normal trade theory, that in which comparative advantage and your relative specialization possibilities drives trade. Instead, in this wrong model, as I've called it, what drives trade is demand. And then demand then drives the supply side. And it's not surprising that that just doesn't fit the trade facts. It also says there's no real competition in that world market. There's very little substitutability between different countries' products. And so it's really hard to break into new markets, which is transparently, of course, false in UK trade terms. When you think about the city dominating world financial markets. So in the kind of proper trade model, where these mechanisms of distance are brought into context. Where the main driver is supply side and comparative advantage, that's the model that really accounts for the UK trade facts. When you simulate it and look at whether it can account for what's happened in the past 40 odd years in UK trade and sectoral composition and all those sorts of things that trade models predict. So by using the wrong model, they've kind of said that the only trade that matters for us is the EU trade, which is transparently false. So carrying on, as has been pointed out, if we go to WTO rules, we do well. Essentially, what happens is that we have to put on tariffs with the EU, and if we don't have a free trade agreement under the WTO rules, because of WTO arrangements. But those tariffs are really expensive for the EU, not for the UK, because the UK will have trade agreements with the rest of the world, which will bring in competition here from world producers. And the EU will have to compete with that, really. And if they've got to face our tariffs, they'll have to absorb them. That's the brutal truth. And so WTO rules means that we are not really affected in terms of our exports because we'll export at world prices due to our free trade agreements. And our home producers will face world price competition. And tariffs from the EU won't make any difference to that. So our producers will get the same prices, whatever the EU tariffs are put on. But the difference will be for the EU because they'll have to absorb the tariffs that we put on. So the irony is that the boot is entirely on the other foot in terms of WTO rules. It's the EU that loses and should really, therefore, I think, realize that no deal under WTO rules is bad for the EU. And we are definitely better off under WTO rules with no deal than we are with delaying. And the kind of clinching point is that, of course, if we delay, we don't only lose all the gains from Brexit, potentially for a long time, because who knows where delay would lead in the end. As been pointed out, it may be difficult really to get the whole thing back on track if we surrender on the delay point. What delay does is it also embroils us in this Eurozone COVID bailout crisis that Tim talked about it. I thought completely correctly, the huge tensions in the Eurozone that this bailout crisis has brought along. And we'll be in there without a veto, and we'll be a sitting duck really in terms of contributing to the problems of the Eurozone over the COVID bailout. So moving on, I think that really means that as John has pointed out, there will be a deal, provided we remain completely clear that we won't delay. There's no doubt that there should be a deal because it's simply common sense for the EU not to have to face tariff barriers against us, as I've tried to explain, and it doesn't really matter to us. So moving on to the whole coronavirus outlook, I think the point is that the virus progression, a lot of people have ignored the facts of how it's progressed. Basically, it's been following the standard behavior of all epidemics, which is the logistic curve, under which an epidemic, and it also applies in many areas of economics, where you get innovations, they take hold and then they spread rapidly, and then gradually you get saturation and slowdown, and that's exactly what happens to this epidemic. And if you look at the next slide, I'll show you the actual progression in many countries. If you put this on a log scale, you can see very clearly that there's a sort of period of great rapidity, and then there's a point at which the whole thing slows down and then gradually flattens off. The slope of this curve, of course, is the rate of growth, the proportional rate of growth, because it's on a log scale. And you can see that across all countries. And the other point to emphasize is that lockdown, which has been such a big element here, is no better than the social guidance. And we can see that from the Swedish data. If you look at Sweden, you can see that the progression of the Swedish coronavirus epidemic has been, again, it's on a log scale. On the right-hand side, you can see Sweden, which is in red. And on the left-hand side, you can see the UK in blue. And you can see they're absolutely, completely the same. So that lockdown and social guidance, which is what they followed in Sweden, are basically equivalent. And it's brought into focus the fact that we followed this lockdown, which has been very expensive to the economy. And Sweden has managed to preserve their economy to a much greater extent. And we haven't really gained anything out of this, which is a great pity that we didn't kind of hold our nerve and follow the Swedish example, really, with social guidance, which we're now doing as we unlock. And so if you look at the forecasts that we make out of this modeling for the future of the disease, you can see on the left-hand side the projection for the UK of new deaths. Very sad, of course, that there have been so many deaths. And you can see that they are gradually falling off and actually have fallen off quite sharply, and they're going to continue to fall off to zero over the next month or so. And the same actually is true of the world as a whole. We've got here a global group of some 25 countries which are the worst affected in terms of deaths. And you can see that there too, there's a strong decline as we go into the final phase of the logistic curve. So I think this is important. And it takes me on to the next thing, which is what sort of recovery are we going to have? And I think, as kind of been implicit in the previous remarks, this recession is a very peculiar one because it's actually caused by the government. So the difference is that if you cause something, if you stop causing it, it stops. And that's really quite different from most recessions, which are caused by things that the government can't control directly. So that, I think, tells us that there should be a V-shaped recovery as we get rid of lockdown and hold our nerve in terms of future reimposition, which at worst, I think, will be local. And needs to be carefully seen in the context of the general decline in deaths that's going on. And we shouldn't just assume that if there's any rise in infections, they'll necessarily result in deaths, because the virus adapts and the people who catch it often don't catch it very badly. So we're going to see the virus retreat in most developed countries, and developing countries couldn't afford this lockdown anyway. So as we will see that as the developed world comes out of lockdown and as is now doing and recovers quite sharply, developing countries will tag along quite gratefully with that thing. And if you look at the latest indicators, you can see that, in fact, as the Bank of England emphasized earlier this week, there's quite a sharp bounce back going on with the flash purchasing managers index in June for manufacturing up to 50, which is on the sort of cusp between going back into growth, having dropped, of course, dreadfully to 40 in May, in April, and then recovered somewhat in May. And in June, it looks as if it's recovered quite a bit, the manufacturing one to 50, and services is not far behind, as you can see in those figures. And retail sales also bouncing back, 12% up in May after the terrible decline in April that's been talked about. And that's also true in the United States, where again, retail sales were up in April after this, in May on April, having dropped sharply in April. So when you add it all up to the world economy level, you get a much more kind of optimistic picture than you'd think was going on from some of the comments you read around the place, particularly in those that are kind of opposed to the government, of course. We see a picture where most of the developed world will drop by about 6%, or maybe a bit more in some cases this year, and then bounce back up next year. So what about the public finances, very briefly? I mean, what we've seen from the data is that a public debt backed by money can finance a crisis like this, just as it can finance a war. And the viability of the finances, in spite of this crisis, rests on the fact that the rate of interest, of course, in this period of low interest rates and a high degree of stagnation that we've seen in the wake of the financial crisis. We've inherited this outlook with interest rates very low, and now they've gone lower in the case with the COVID crisis. And we're looking at an interest rate that the government is very fortunate to be borrowing at of 0.4%. And it can get this on very long maturities. So if it's got any sense, what it should do is borrow very long at this rate of interest, and that'll keep the cost of this crisis down a lot. And so really the government should be moving towards issuing perpetuities with only the coupon and no promise of redemption, much as it did in some wartime, with some wartime issues. And then you get into the final question, which is, what do we do about this huge increase of money? And how do we deal with the sort of fiscal problem that it's got to borrow, but so far it's simply lent to itself, because the Bank of England has actually issued 300 billion, or will have done by the end of this year, 300 billion in quantitative easing, which has more or less matched the issue of debt by the government. So far the government's only lent to itself, which has been quite an easy thing to do, of course. But as we move into the post-recovery situations, we go through recovery, it really is important the Bank of England offloads this debt into the market to make use of this low interest rate environment. Otherwise, the public sector is holding this debt, and as interest rates rise, it'll find it's got to finance it at higher and higher interest rates. But as Tim has pointed out, and here I completely agree with him, as recovery occurs, the money supply growth rate is going to threaten inflation. It'd probably be fended off until things get normal, but we're going to have quite a fast recovery. So this problem is going to arise faster than anybody thinks. And so what really the aim of the government should be, and the Bank of England, it should be to get rid of this debt into the private sector at as low interest rates as possible, and at long enough maturities that it can get until the recovery takes hold. And then the question really is, that my thing's not working anymore. I don't know why. I don't know why this isn't working anymore. Oh, here we are. Then we get to the last point, which is, given that we've managed, the government's been very fortunate in a way with these very low interest rates during this crisis. What sort of scope does it leave for the post-Brexit fiscal policy that it wants to pursue? And the answer is quite a lot, because the cost of 0.4%, imagine that the whole of the debt we managed to be reissued as a perpetuity at 0.4%. That actually can be paid for by the taxpayer with the same amount in terms of income tax. It comes to about one penny in the pound on income tax to pay that debt interest rate. So the government's been very fortunate on that, but it also means that as it goes forward into the post-Brexit period, it can actually do more to support the economy than many people are saying. It can actually fund tax cuts, and it really ought to be pursuing quite strong fiscal policy and trying to mop up the excess money. And what could these tax cuts be? Well, they could be corporation tax, getting rid of this penal top rate, cutting the top rate of income tax, cutting the standard rate as well, and also spending money on infrastructure, as it's talking about. And all these tax cuts would not just support the economy in general, they would have particular impact in the north, which is what they want to benefit, because the north has more supply side potential and is very responsive to tax cuts and the competitiveness that will bring. And so I think the situation is one of where we can be quite optimistic that actually the government can do well going forward. And all this would, such a program that would support growth would in fact raise growth through the tax cut supply side route that we saw in Mrs. Thatcher's period, where a lot of taxes were cut and a lot of regulations were straightened up. It gave us much stronger growth. I think we face the same prospect today. So I think sort of sweeping up behind my other respected speakers, I would say that the outlook is actually quite optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Patrick. I'd now like to turn to some of the questions that we've had in. The first one I'm going to put to our panel is Andy Haldane, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, did not support the latest injection of QE by the Bank of England. And it seems that he believes, therefore, that a V-shaped recovery will occur. However, ministers have talked about a 1930s style slump and the requirement for a Rooseveltian response. What do our panelists think? Do they foresee the V-shaped recovery as Mr. Haldane seems to envisage, as we are also likely to see in the United States? And if that is so, surely a Rooseveltian approach is inappropriate. Would any of our speakers like to comment on that, Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's going to be a V-shaped recovery, partly because of the monetary growth that we've seen. And I just don't think that there's going to be any serious efforts to cancel or pull back the extra money that's been created in the last few months. Because in America, the presidential election, which is an American matters to all of us. The other point, which I think is quite important, is actually that a lot of normal replacement and maintenance work that one would see in this 3 to 6 month period hasn't happened. There's going to be a backlog. Again, there's evidence that one's picking up of supply shortages in all sorts of areas, you know, that you go to a website, order something, haven't got it. And that suggests to me that there's a lot of work to catch up as a result. So I think we'll see the inflation sooner, actually, than it's not just going to be in 21 and 22, and maybe see some of it this year.
Gerard, any comments on this point? Is Gerard there?
Yes. The challenge I have in describing it as a V-shaped recovery is that when I say that to non-economists, they think it implies everything returns immediately back to where it was just as quickly as it collapsed. If you look at the data, in fact, my forecast, the annual forecast, would be pretty similar to Patrick's, actually, down 6.5% this year, up over 6% next year. For most sectors, it will be V-shaped, but there are a number of sectors where their business models can't return to normal in the social distancing phase or until a vaccine is found. Now, there's lots of positive news on the vaccine. Listening to Pfizer description last week from the Milken Institute, they hope to have a vaccine before the end of this calendar year. Challenge is it will not be widely available probably until the middle of next year. So if you look at the data on the quarterly basis or an annual basis, it certainly supports a V-shape. But the point I would stress is that there will be some sectors of the economy, and that some of those sectors are important sectors that cannot return to normal until we actually get out of the vaccine gap phase, until there's a vaccine. So it's just the way you describe it. I think now is not the time to be negative about the UK or the global economy. I would be positive. I certainly concur with Patrick's comment. Unlocking really allows these economies to recover. And as Tim and John touched on, the policy stimulus is significant. The combination of all those factors, I think, allows the UK and the world economy to recover. But it's just the way you, in terms of describing it, it's just that there are some sectors particularly culture, creative, hospitality sectors that will need help. And therefore, I'm reluctant to call it a V shape just because some sectors that are important will still be impacted until the end of next year. But I think we can get carried away whether it's a V or a U. I think we are recovering and we will continue to recover.
Thank you. John Redwood.
Well, I think we do need a substantial fiscal boost this year, and I think the aim must be to get recovery to be as fast as possible and to only do this once, because you cannot carry on living in the way we have been doing, where a large number of people are not working and where the state then pays for them not to work, and you create the money to do that. You have to get back to work in order to earn the living standards you want. So I'm with Patrick in thinking that I would like definite tax reductions in the short term to give that extra boost to recovery. I'm with Gerard in saying it's not a straight V recovery, because quite large chunks of the economy will not be able to get back to where they were anytime soon. But I'm with Tim in thinking that because of the extent of the monetary stimulus already, the things that people do want to do and can do may well be in short supply, and we're going to need a very rapid transition of resource to get up to speed to satisfy those, and there could be some price consequences of it all. So I don't think there was a need for extra quantitative easing at that particular meeting. I think there is need for a sensible fiscal package either Wednesday or in the autumn. And above all, the government's got to come up with the right answer on how you get out of furlough without transferring a lot of those people straight into redundancy and long-term unemployment. And we need good answers to that, and there may need to be some government initiative there, as the government has taken on responsibility for around 9 million people at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Patrick, anything further to add?
Just, I agree with much of what's just been said. The point really is that we do need a fiscal boost to the economy, but we also need to take money out. And in a way, you know, this is a key element in solving the awful problem we've had of the zero interest economy. And by being forceful on fiscal policy, but I agree with Tim, we need to tighten up monetary policy. We need to get this QE reversed, essentially. That reversal of QE will push up interest rates as we go into 2021, I think, to be realistic on the timing. And that will mean that it'll solve one of the big problems we've got, which is that monetary policy at the moment is powerless because it's right at the zero bound. And so I see an opportunity here to use fiscal policy to do the sorts of things we need in the way of tax cuts from the supply side point of view in a safe way, because the balance sheet of the government is in good shape fundamentally, although you wouldn't have expected it after a huge crisis like this, but it is because of the reasons that we talked about. But monetary policy really needs to be tightened. I mean, they need to get rid of this QE. In this sense, I think that Andy Haldane was right to oppose more, you know, because they're going in the wrong direction. They need to reverse that stuff to get the debt out into the private sector, into the market, so that it sticks at low interest rates. At the moment, it's all in the public sector. And so they're running big risks, because as interest rates rise when monetary policy is tightened, they'll find the burden of fiscal policy will get bigger and bigger. So it's important that they act very carefully on the timing here. Fiscal boost, but tighten QE.
Thank you very much. Is that the general feeling on the panel, that we need higher interest rates next year? Tim?
Barry, can I just say something?
Yes, please.
Okay, you know, I'm very much in favor of a balanced budget and strong public finances. I'm not going to be budged on that. And I am very concerned about all this talk of fiscal giveaways and so on. No, we must, in the medium term, get back to strong public finances. I have to say that the current bond yields are extraordinary. And you might say, if you can sell undated debt at 0.5%, then for heaven's sake, we must do that, mustn't we? Patrick, I have no problems. If we can replace all that long-dated debt with undated at 0.5%, Wonderful. Let's just see whether the markets will actually let it wash. And also, before I finish, the central bank, the government can always create money. That money will always affect asset prices, it will affect other things too. Monetary policy can never be powerless, and zero interest rates do not mean monetary policy is impotent.
Thank you. Gerard, any points on the interest rate policy for next year?
Yeah, just before answering that explicitly, I think the key thing is that we need a pro-growth policy in the sense of ensuring that we incentivize the sector. Hence, the Treasury, I get the impression, is talking about future tax increases. And I think the debate today is right to put tax cuts on the agenda. The good thing is that we've ruled out austerity but the debate still needs to be won in terms of what to do in the next phase of fiscal policy. And I think we need a pro-growth agenda. Now that leads on to the interest rate debate. I too would have opposed the additional QE the other week. The interesting debate is about the shape of the yield curve, I think. In Japan in recent years, they've pegged 10-year yields at zero. There's been some debate around the Fed at the moment as to whether they should peg 10-year yields. When Mark Carney was governor, he gave the impression that tightening would come through short-term rates going up to maybe something like 1.5% before he would have quantitative tightening. The current governor has indicated the other way around, quantitative tightening before maybe needing to move short-term rates. So there's a different emphasis on policy, but certainly at the moment, as the IMF pointed out, International Monetary Fund pointed out last week, global public debt is at a record high, but in the current environment of low inflation, low rates and low yields, it's a great environment to sell that debt, and I would agree that we should be selling it to the private sector. And the other point is to say the Debt Management Office in the UK has done a remarkable job. When one looks at the maturity of UK debt, it's about 16 years. The maturity of, say, German debt is about 6 years. And over the last week, 30-year gilt yields in the UK effectively crossed or reached the same level as 30-year yields from Japan. So it's a great environment to basically take advantage of this to sell more debt, no doubt about that.
Thank you. John Redwood, any comments on the economic priorities for next year?
Well, there's only one priority, which is recovery. Recovery, recovery, recovery. Everything must be done to make it easier, either for companies with furloughed employees to adjust their business models so that they have gainful employment for those furloughed employees, or to ensure that as the furlough runs off and they lose their jobs, they are retrained and helped as quickly as possible into the new jobs that will emerge, because I think we will find a very progressive change in the economy. I think what we're seeing is the compression of maybe 5 to 10 years digital revolution into the space of 5 to 10 months. And so trends that were underway, the switch from traditional shops to online retailing, the switch from in-person events to remote events, the switch from physical entertainment to more in-home download entertainment and so forth, which were trends that you could define, some more pronounced than others. They've all suddenly been massively accelerated by the enforced lockdown and requirement of most people to spend most of their time at home. And not all of that is going to go back. We're going to see quite a lot of that captured. I think we're going to see office-based businesses allowing or even encouraging many more people to work from home remotely with the remote technology and so forth. So you'd expect to see the need for a big expansion of cybersecurity, digital broadband, networks, download materials, all that kind of thing, apps. This is going to be where we're going to get accelerated growth, and you're going to get scarring or emaciation of some of the traditional and more marginal hospitality, entertainment, leisure, travel businesses who are under enormous financial pressure, and there will be bankruptcies and financial reconstructions. So we want the fastest possible growth, and government has to be involved, because government at the moment is, as I keep reminding you, carrying the incomes and the futures of about 9 million people through furlough, which cannot go on. So everything in terms of fiscal policy, tax policy, government procurement, whatever, has to be geared to easing that transition, encouraging that training, making sure it's as painless as possible.
Thank you, John. The next question concerns the Northern Ireland Protocol. There seems to be a lot of hostility in the Bruges group to the concept of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the possibility of a border down the Irish Sea. What would be the objectives of members of the panel in dealing with the Northern Ireland Protocol in the negotiations that are now taking place? Tim, have you any thoughts on the Northern Ireland Protocol?
This is a very technical subject.
Yeah.
As I understand it, it is possible to have an indivisible border and still have trade. I remember going some years ago, curious enough, with Kenneth Clark in the same car, crossing the border into Switzerland. There were no border checks. Now, this is between Switzerland, not a member of the EU, and an EU country. This is possible 20 years or so back. What is all this problem with Northern Ireland? But I don't understand the technicalities straight away.
Thank you. Gerard, any views on this issue?
Yeah, I'm not going to claim specific expertise on this, but when I looked at it before, it was an issue of principle often more than practicality. There was already, as the MPs or members of Parliament from Northern Ireland pointed out, a border in the Irish Sea in terms of livestock, etc. And when one looks at the shape of the Northern Ireland economy, it's still very heavily public sector and localized economy. So the extent to which it would, the practicality of it, I mean, the scale of it is probably the word I'm looking for. It's an issue that matters more in principle, it often seems to me, than it does in terms of the scale, in terms of the impact it would have. But I can't really say more than that. I think some of the things made in the withdrawal, in the political declaration, seem to tie our hands slightly on this, as far as I could make out.
John Redwood, you've always been a very strong supporter of the Union. Have you any views on the protocol?
Well, I don't think the political declaration can be binding after we've left transition. And I think there is a feeling on the UK side that the EU hasn't stuck to all their side in the political declaration, and it was a political declaration, not a binding treaty, for good reasons, because it was subject to further discussion and negotiation. I think the UK has to remain, as I believe it has been in the negotiations so far, crystal clear that it was always the intention that Northern Ireland would be fully part of the single market and customs union that is the United Kingdom. The UK was also very clear in the previous negotiations that we saw no need and had no wish to impose new physical barriers along the borderlands between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and I see no reason why we need to change that. The trade can be properly monitored in the way that it is today without having to have lorries physically stopping at a border and filling in bits of paper. All these things now move around on electronic manifests with computer programs, and people know what's in the trucks. And if the Republic of Ireland and the EU wishes to have the same, they can do the same on their side of the border. And we just hope that they will not want to put anything on their side of the border, because we can't see the need for this clumsy physical border, which is would not be welcome and is certainly not wanted by the UK government. So I think it has been used as a political issue, whereas those who know more about it than I do feel there are many easy technical fixes on this, while sticking to the essential principle that all of the United Kingdom leaves the European Union.
Thank you very much, John. I've now got a question from Lindsay Jenkins. She says, The Prime Minister has claimed that build, build, build emulates FDR's New Deal. Is he right? Secondly, does the panel believe that the New Deal is the answer for the UK? Patrick, I'm sure you've discovered that you've researched the economic policies of the 1930s in some detail. What is your reaction to this question?
Well, I think that's a fair point. That I think, as I kind of tried to say in my fiscal discussion, we need tax cuts fundamentally. I think spending on infrastructure is fine, and to some degree, it's the important thing is to get the infrastructure spending right as needed. Just spending on infrastructure is a pretty inefficient thing to do unless you've got a good infrastructure program that's well matched to needs of infrastructure. I think there is scope for infrastructure spending, and the package announced so far is quite moderate, really. I think it comes to about 20-30 billion a year. And I would say the main need for fiscal policy is to encourage the supply side and the competitiveness of industry. As I argued in my remarks, the North will benefit a lot from tax cuts because it has a very big industrial manufacturing sector which responds to those things, and there's quite a lot of labor capacity in the North. So I think that the tax cuts will have their effect in the North. I mean, a lot of this FDR comparison, I think, is overdone, really, because it's tax cuts we need. And FDR didn't do tax cuts. He did massive public spending and public hiring, which I don't think is what we need. I think we need a degree of that, but mainly we need to have a fiscal support in the way of tax cuts and getting people back into jobs, as John Redwood has said, which is going to come from free market spending.
Thank you, Patrick. Gerard, I think you studied under Patrick Minford at one stage, and I wonder what your thoughts are now on infrastructure spending and these implications.
Yeah, well, in terms of the New Deal, in terms of the question coming on to that, Roosevelt heavily criticized his predecessor, Hoover, for excessive government spending, and then he took it to a different level. I don't think it's the best example to use for now, because what he spent on one hand, he took away on the other hand. In fiscal, I remember, in fiscal terms, it wasn't a huge fiscal boost. He actually raised lots of taxes. And I don't think it was until 1942, if I remember correctly, that the US got back to where it was in 1929. And it was as much to do with the Second World War as what happened under Roosevelt. I think there is a case for infrastructure spending. To reinforce the point that I think everyone's made, we have a unique situation at the moment of low inflation, low rates and low yields that makes it so cheap for the government to borrow. And the Prime Minister made the point the other day, when rates are so low and your returns are so high, why wouldn't you invest? Patrick touched on the challenge though, it's where do you invest? The only shovel-ready projects, and this is where the relevance with Roosevelt is, he focused on shovel-ready projects. The only shovel-ready projects seem to be HS2 and potholes, from what I can make out. Maybe as a result of the coronavirus, and Policy Exchange did some very good work on this, you could have a health-focused cycle lanes and other types of aspects. That's a very positive. Also, the thing Policy Exchange pointed out was that much of the benefits from infrastructure is improving your current quality of your current existing infrastructure. Obviously, the easing of the planning restrictions was important. We have a very flexible labour market, a very flexible product market. You could say changing the planning regulations, make it a very flexible planning market, if that's the right way to say it, is important in terms of the infrastructure effects to come through quickly. But there is benefits, but I can agree with Professor Patrick, it's about the supply side aspect. Coming out of this crisis is not only about boosting demand, there's a lot of pent-up demand, it's also very much making sure our supply side is able to cope.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, the next question I've got is, in the event of no deal, could most favoured nation clauses be a barrier to trade? Tim, have you any thoughts on this particular aspect?
I'm baffled by that. The point about most favoured nation clauses is that you must not discriminate against any. You can have a high tariff, but you mustn't discriminate against other nations. So that I'm in favour of no tariffs at all, ideally, and no import restrictions. So, but no, I don't understand what that's all about, I'm afraid.
Okay. Anything further on this, Patrick?
Well, just to say that under WTO rules, you have to have an MFN tariff unless you want to put it to zero, which I kind of agree with Tim. I really would prefer to get rid of it altogether, but that would be unilateral free trade, which politicians are very reluctant to do because they want to do trade agreements with quid pro quo, and they think that's politically easier to do, which is, I'm sympathetic to them. So if you're going to do free trade agreements, those are the way that you can discriminate. But as Tim has said, if you don't have a free trade agreement with somebody, you have to apply your general tariff, which is your MFN tariff. So there's really no way around that. I mean, MFN tariffs, if you have them, you've got to apply to everybody unless you have a free trade agreement with them. And so under WTO rules, if we don't have a free trade agreement with the EU, we will have MFN tariffs by WTO rules imposed on them and vice versa.
John Redwood, are you one of these politicians that, as Patrick suggests, that overly favours trade agreements rather than just trading under WTO rules?
Well, I think they can add something, and I explained in my opening remarks that I think we've got the chance to improve on our very good trade with places like America, Australia, New Zealand under WTO rules with no special deal, with a special deal that would remove the remaining EU tariffs that we currently have to impose. And one of the great pleasures of leaving the EU is that we can stop placing tariffs on things like oranges, which we're never going to grow for ourselves, which the EU puts tariffs on at certain times of year to stop imports from outside the EU. If I could also briefly say something on infrastructure, because you didn't come to me on that one. But I think on infrastructure, there is huge opportunity because of the low interest rates and the potential availability of capital. I'd like much more of it to be done by private sector borrowing against proper market tests. It seems to me this is a good time to complete the upgrade and capacity increase of our broadband network, which is going to be critical to all the new jobs and activities we're going to be doing. We still have a lot of travel impediments in our various transport networks that could be de-bottlenecked with relatively quick-fire projects, not with very large projects, but with a series of smaller projects for raising capacity. And for example, digital signaling giving you, say, 25% increase in capacity on existing track and dealing with problem roadblocks, bad junctions and so forth on the road network. I've already talked about the need to have more domestic energy capacity, maybe rejigging the cat's cradle of subsidies and interventions, which are not terribly customer friendly at the moment. I think we need more water capacity. So I think, yes, let's drive ahead with a really big investment program, but let's try and make sure more of the burden of that is financed privately, because just the state can borrow for nothing at the moment. So long-term infrastructure investments by the private sector ought to be at very low interest rates, giving people plenty of opportunity. And with the great city of London available, surely it's a challenge they could rise to marry the easy money with the projects.
Could I just say something on this front, Barry? I mean, I very much agree with what John has been saying, but I'm sure John would agree with me if this phrase "value for money." I mean, what this phrase "infrastructure," and then we look what the government's spending the money on. Is spending money on HS2. I'm sorry, it's not value for money. It's spending money on nuclear power stations with enormous subsidies. It's not value for money. One of the reasons for low productivity growth is we're wasting our nation's resources on these sort of vanity projects of various kinds. And so I do worry that it's a low interest rate. Let's borrow, let's spend. No, the resources are scarce. We must use the resources carefully. And so I'm sure John would agree with me, value for money, please.
Well, I don't think John Redwood's ever been in support of HS2, but John, could you come in on this point?
Yeah, as Tim will know, I was an opponent of HS2 and I voted against HS2. And I'm afraid it doesn't make a lot of economic sense, that project. And there are many cheaper ways of getting more capacity on the railway much more quickly. Because one of the problems with HS2 is it's going to be years and years before it's available. That's right.
In fact, with HS2 as well, I think the full employment benefit from it even takes 7 years from now. It is a crazy waste of money. One thing that might be necessary, I think, is the devolution aspect, that there should be some constraint, limit, whatever word you want to call it, maybe something, still a lot of money, but maybe something like £500 million and anything less, that should be devolved to local areas where there's full accountability, better governance. The idea of Whitehall being able to decide what's the best way to spend money in Nottingham isn't clear to me, and should have the local politicians should have greater accountability for it so people can hold them to account. I think the value for money aspect is vital.
Thank you very much indeed. I wonder if each of the panelists could give their estimation of the likelihood of a deal being done, and if there is no deal, does that particularly worry any of our panelists? Tim.
I have to say I've got no special insight on that question. It's obviously very much, I don't know if the negotiators themselves know whether there's going to be a deal anyhow, because they're in the dark just as we are. Can I just say, you know, we're talking, a membership of the EU is historic. You think about, there was a split between Ireland and the United Kingdom many years ago. It was very painful for Ireland for two generations. You ask the Irish, do they want to become part of the United Kingdom again? No. And so let's just be clear. These are things about the definition of the nation you belong to. As far as I'm concerned, I want to be friends with our neighbours. I want to play with them, visit them, and so on. But no, I want Britain to be Britain.
Thank you. Gerard Lyons?
Well, I think the current stance we have in the negotiations is right. My guess is the politicians will do a deal for the end of the year, but I think we should leave with no deal if we can't do a deal. I do think we need to present ourselves better globally in terms of getting our global message out there.
John Redwood.
Well, I agreed with the original British government line after the vote, which was no deal is better than a bad deal. And so I'm urging this government not to give in on any of those crucial issues. We don't give away fish, money, laws, powers, court, all the rest of it. And I think the only way to have a chance of getting the kind of free trade arrangement we would quite like is to hang tough. I think if we do that, it's going to be very close to the end of the year before the EU cracks. I think there's a chance if you hang tough, the EU will crack and you end up with a perfectly nice free trade agreement, which I'd be happy with. And if they don't crack, it's terribly important not to compromise, but to leave, because we would be better off leaving than compromising yet again when the previous government compromised too much on all these other things. And the other thing I just wanted to make clear, because of the way I was introduced, is that I am here as John Redwood. I'm not here on behalf of any commercial interest, you must understand.
Thank you, John. Patrick.
Yes, I kind of agree with John. I mean, I think there will be a deal because, as I tried to say in my remarks, the EU is the one that suffers from no deal because of it will actually have to pay these tariffs, which are on UK. On its exports to the UK, it'll have to absorb them, and that will reduce its profit margins hugely. I mean, you look at Irish kind of industry, it's hugely dependent on the UK market, and so is French industry and German industry. So common sense at the EU level says they should have a deal because they really don't want to be having a situation of WTO rules and these tariffs. So there's been a lot of bluster and bluffing from the EU to sort of try it on, because obviously they don't want us to leave. They want to carry on charging us excessive prices and all the rest of it and controlling us. So why would they cooperate? Why wouldn't they try it on? Particularly when Remainers are helping them as much as they can to kind of avoid a proper Brexit. So it is important, as John has stressed, that we hang tough. And if we do, I'm sure there will be a deal.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Well, we've had presentations and we've had a very good discussion, and we've been online now for nearly 2 hours. So I'd like to conclude this meeting. I would like to give a very big thank you to all of the panelists, because they've obviously put in a tremendous amount of preparation for their presentation, and we've had the benefit of their great expertise this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye.